everybody, Phantom here. Welcome to the channel Phantom Era, where we talk about everything from the weird and wacky to the educational and downright preposterous. Today, we are going to be talking about the Great Collapse. When I say great, I don't mean that this was a spectacular, fantabulous event. I say great in the sense that this was a very large tragedy that took place. So in order to start and kind of paint the picture of what's going on, I'm going to give you a little bit of background regarding the incident, or what I should say led up to the incident, the location, building practices, and things like that. So Cave Creek is a small stream that flows through Paparoa National Park in New Zealand, and due to the scenic nature of the area, a viewing platform was designed and implemented for tourists as well as locals to view the scenery and better view the creek that traversed a 40-meter chasm down below. Now, the reason this place was named Cave Creek was pretty simple. So the creek that is at the bottom of the 40-meter chasm comes out of a cave, and there's like an intersection where the creek and the cave meet, and thus Cave Creek was born. It's basically 1 + 1 = 2. Because this was such a very beautiful site as far as nature goes, and the scenery was amazing and everything like that, the DOC, which is the Department of Conservation, was like, yeah, we're going to slap a platform in there. It'll be great. People can appreciate nature for what it is. It'll bring in a lot of like tourists, and the locals will enjoy it. It'll be a blast for everybody. Unfortunately, they didn't have anybody with the correct qualifications in order to build the platform. So there were a lot of oversights that ended up taking place. Some oversights including a use of nails instead of bolts. In particular, nails were used on bearers instead of bolts. For those who don't know, bearers are the portion of a building that is designed to take a large amount of weight. Specifically described by Google as a construction building block designed to carry weight over an expansive floor span, mainly any horizontal beam, joint, or building part that supports a considerable load of weight. In order to anchor these properly, you need something that's substantive in like size and like thickness, and that sounds really weird, but like you need a good solid bolt. You can't just hammer a bunch of nails in and say, oh yep, that's good, it'll be fine, like nothing bad's gonna happen. So considering that the platform was a very big attraction, it became increasingly unstable the more people crowded onto it. And this is for reasons that I will get into a little bit later, but it's because of the lack of qualifications during the building process that tragedy ultimately struck. A group of Thai Putini Polytechnic students from Greymouth visited the park on a field trip. These are college-age kids for the most part, but if you've ever been on a field trip, you know that regardless, it's exciting and often emotionally charged with, like curiosity, like I said, excitement, you're out with your friends, you're not in school, like it's a very invigorating experience. So all of these students were out on the platform. I will detail how they got there later, having a good old time, enjoying each other's company, and none of them really thought that there would be any sort of danger or any sort of threat or risk to their well-being. Unfortunately, the field trip was inevitably stained with blood and death. So the group was quite large, roughly about 23 people from my calculations and research. Again, math is not my strong suit, so I could definitely be wrong, but I do believe it's about 23 people that were actually on this trip. At one point during the field trip, a Polytechnic tutor, a DOC officer, which as I mentioned earlier is Department of Conservation, and then 3 students split off from the main group, so they were separated from the bulk of the field trip party. So this left a total of 17 other students and a DOC officer alone. Because of this split, the group of 17 students and their DOC officer arrived to the Cave Creek platform first. It's noted in a lot of reports that they huddled together at the edge of the platform around 11:25 a.m., and a couple of students were quick to notice that the platform was unsteady, and then several of the students just kind of jokingly stomped around, jumped on it, tried to shake it. A very immature thing to do, but again, as I mentioned, they're college students, and I will say that I myself have done something similar. So in Jerome, Arizona, there are mine shafts that you can tour, and there are platforms with plexiglass over them. I was about 13 or 14 at the time when I was there, maybe a little bit younger, and I was standing on the plexiglass platform, and my brain went, hey, let's see how stable this is. So I started jumping on it and slamming my feet around to see if it would break or fall. You trust that what you are standing on is built to withhold what it is that you are doing to it. I didn't think that the platform was actually going to break. It was just more of an impulsive, haha, I'm a kid and I'm a little immature and this is what I'm doing type of thing. And I very much suspect that this is what these students were doing. They're like joking around, just kind of being like, oh, it's gonna fall, never actually suspecting that something bad was going to happen. Unfortunately for them, the structure actually collapsed, tipping forward with all 17 students and the DOC officer on it. Now, if you remember, I noted that the chasm below was 40 meters deep. They reportedly landed on a ledge that was about 30 meters deep, but if you take the length of the 40-meter chasm and convert it to feet, because us Americans don't use the metric system, that's about 131 feet total. So that is a massive, massive drop. Like, that is a brutal fall. Surprisingly, despite dropping about 131 feet, definitely a little bit less if they did land on the 30-meter mark, 4 students survived through initial injuries. One student reportedly had spinal injuries. Many of them had broken bones. Like I said, they dropped a great distance. The remaining 13 students died along with the DOC officer. Shortly after the collapse, the second group that I mentioned previously ended up coming across the scene. After studying the scene, the DOC officer that was with the second group put together what had happened, and then this DOC officer, along with a student, ran back towards the trail that they'd taken, which inevitably took them to a car. Now, the plan was to originally drive and go get help because that would be the quickest way to do it, but it was quickly discovered that the keys weren't with the vehicles, and instead with one of the deceased down in the chasm. Because of this, they were in deep, deep water. Already there was a lot of trouble going on, and instead of getting help himself, or their self, the DOC officer was never actually gendered, so she, her, they, them, could be anybody. Instead of actually getting help, the DOC officer returned to the scene after sending the student to go and get help. Some people say that the student ended up biking. Others say that they ended up running. Either way, it took them about 8 kilometers before they were able to get to a phone and call the police. By the time the student successfully phoned the police in Greymouth, it was about 12:15, meaning that half an hour had passed. And while it may seem like 30 minutes isn't that big of a deal, for the critically injured, it's quite literally the difference between life and death. Literally every second counts in a situation like this. And despite, being relatively quick to get help, the first person to arrive on scene of the accident was a Greymouth police officer, a police constable, who showed up on foot 2 hours after the initial incident. Meaning that at this point, anyone else who may have survived aside from the 4 eventual survivors had likely died to their injuries if they weren't killed instantly. And this is supported by reports saying that up to 6 people had survived the initial fall in and of itself. And if you're decent at math, that means 2 people would have died or perished later on due to injuries in order for there to only be a total of 4 survivors from the fall itself. Now, due to the remoteness of the location, it was extremely difficult for the survivors to be helped out of the situation, though they were eventually air evac'd and taken to hospitals for their injuries to be treated. It wasn't until about 5:30 p.m., I believe, that all of the bodies were removed from the chasm and also air evac'd. As I mentioned earlier, the person who had, I think the worst injuries out of the survivors was one unfortunate person who had severe spinal injuries, and that is very, very hard to rehab and get full motion back and things like that. It is a very difficult, arduous process, and so it is very, very unfortunate that they had to deal with something like that. So due to the severity of the tragedy that happened, an investigation was launched to determine what had happened and how it had happened and what caused it to happen. And when I tell you that it is absolutely mind-boggling how negligent the construction of the platform was, I mean it. After a commission of inquiry was filed in regard to the incident by Graham Noble, a district judge, they discovered that the Department of Conservation was responsible for the following, and I'm going to quote here. The platform had not been designed or approved by a qualified engineer. Nails were used to secure the platform instead of bolts, as intended by the design, meaning that it was intended for the design to use bolts instead of nails. because they did not bring an appropriate drill to the building site. They did not have the appropriate tools, so they said, yeah, we're going to wing it and hope for the best. The steps to the platform, which were supposed to be attached as a counterweight, had not been properly attached. By the time this was realized, the plans had been lost and replacement schematics were hastily drawn by an unqualified volunteer exchange student so as to lodge a retrospective application. Further consideration about the Building Act then resulted in the consent never being lodged. So, a building consent was never, officially acquired by these people. So they didn't have legal permission to be doing any of this. And somehow they got away with it. I'm still not really sure how this happened. So not only were the steps not attached, but they didn't have a building consent form for this at all. There was no official documentation saying, yes, you can build here. So they didn't even know if the terrain was safe to be doing what they were doing. Additionally, the platform was not listed in any register that would have resulted in regular inspections. And a warning sign for the platform suggesting a maximum limit of 5 people had been ordered, but was never installed at the site. When I say that this is just absolutely appalling, I mean, this is misstep after misstep, and it's intentional. It is just pure, sheer negligence of these people, and they got away with it. To further the egregiousness of the DOC's negligence, it's documented that the platform itself was actually built off-site and then flown in by a helicopter to be installed, only it didn't come with instructions, and instead of seeking to get instructions for it, they just built it and installed it anyways, meaning that the proper installation method was not followed, and essentially the entire installation for the platform was performed by improv. They made it up. They said, does that look right? Yeah, we're going to slap some nails in there, we might add some Elmer's glue or whatever, and hope for the best. Additionally, it was discovered that the DOC was severely underfunded, meaning that they had to cut corners in many of their projects just to get them done. So they didn't even have the money to do their job, so they were doing things illegally and still not really doing their job because they did it incorrectly. It is reported that this lack of funding was the overall reason that led to the specific errors in the platform itself. Because of this, the report of the commission concluded that, given the department's state, financial state, and employment state, and basically the entire existence of the department, I'm going to quote here, a tragedy such as Cave Creek was almost bound to happen. Because of this commission and the tragic deaths of 9 people, the Department of Conservation went on to inspect more than 250 structures and eventually closed 65 of them due to repairs and safety concerns, meaning that aside from the Cave Creek platform, there were dozens of other structures in need of better construction because they weren't built properly the first time. Sadly, this means that the Commission's assessment that a tragedy like Cave Creek was almost bound to happen was actually accurate. I mean, if you have 65 structures that have to be closed down or outright removed because they weren't built properly, you are just asking to have people die. You are literally so negligent in what it is that you are doing that you are literally going to kill people. I'm surprised that the Cave Creek incident was the only one that happened. Thankfully, because of the tragedy, the 65 structures that needed to be repaired or outright removed were removed or effectively repaired and then reopened so that people weren't going to die by using the structures that the DOC had built. Now, unfortunately, at this time, the DOC was not taken to court due to its negligence because, from my understanding of it, government agencies in New Zealand were not allowed to be prosecuted by other government agencies, and they couldn't prosecute themselves either. So despite this, I do have to say the victims' families were awarded $2.6 million amongst themselves, and laws were eventually changed so that agencies like the DOC could be prosecuted for negligent actions. Additionally, a memorial was displayed beside the incident site to remember and honor those who perished at the site. And while a memorial is certainly a very sweet sentiment, it does little in the grand scheme of things, in my opinion. Those who survived the tragedy suffer both mental, physical, and emotional injuries after years, after being removed from the incident for years. They are still suffering these things. I read a handful of interviews, and it is sad. There is one individual in particular who suffers a lot of survival guilt, and they feel like it should have been them that had died instead of their classmates and their friends. And I just cannot imagine feeling that way, having to see that and experience it and go, well, why wasn't it me? Why was it them? I guess for me, the part that's hardest is that no matter how old you get, students who are on a field trip, even if they are young adults, should be safe on a field trip. They should have been allowed to goof off and enjoy each other's company and just kind of do what young adults do. But instead, they died or were scarred for the rest of their lives, all due to the negligence of people who were trusted to act legally and appropriately in the construction of a project that was for the community. Again, I hope that this video, while it is critical, gives us some insight into how the actions and shortcuts that we take as people and companies and institutions can impact other people from small to incredibly big ways. It goes to show that we need to properly fund local agencies if we want them to perform tasks like this, keep tabs on them, inspect them, monitor them to ensure that the jobs they should be doing are being done correctly. I know it sounds tedious and it costs quite a bit of money to do that, but it's worth it because you're saving lives. At the end of the day, shortcuts are never good when it comes to engineering or building of any kind. If you don't do it right the first time, you're not really going to get a second chance to do it right the second time. It's an all or nothing scenario. You have to do it right the first time. So always take care in your projects, whether on a local or state level. I mean, it can literally save lives. And when I talk about the survivors, one thing that really stuck out to me is that one of the people who survived the accident, they didn't want to come forward and say that they had been jumping on the platform because they felt like it was their fault. And again, I want to reiterate, a platform should not collapse just by goofing around on it and jumping up and down. That should not happen. You should have proper maintenance. You should be inspecting it. You should be closing it when it needs to be closed and repairing it when it needs to be repaired. So anybody who thinks that they're going to blame the people who were jumping on the platform, please don't. Please don't. It legitimately was not their fault. A small impulsive action like that should not be given a consequence of death and plummeting 40 meters into a chasm. Again, I just hope that we can learn from this, and I'm glad that stuff was changed and adjusted following the tragedy. But as I mentioned in the Byford Dolphin incident, it sucks that it takes people dying for things like this to be done. I don't really have much more to say. It's a bit of a downer as far as the story goes, but I do want to say thank you for watching. And if you would like more content like this in the future, please consider liking, leaving a comment, and subscribing. It really, really helps. You guys have shown a lot of love on the Byford Dolphin incident video, and I really, really appreciate that so much. And I really think that this helps educate people and kind of hold people accountable when it comes to accidents like this. So thank you again for watching, and I will see all of you guys in the next video.